Today I'm doing a little tutorial of flying south from Boulder to Golden and passing the Flatirons and eventually going over to Roxborough State Park at the end. So I'll be covering the strategy and tactics from a flying perspective of how to do it, as well as highlighting the really sensitive do not land areas and the landing zones you can go to. If you are really new to cross country, I first recommend getting comfortable flying to the north, which is the direction we're looking at, because the landing zone situation is much friendlier. So it's a little more accommodating for making mistakes and bombing out. So, if you are still working on trying to figure out how to find climbs and map and track thermals and figuring out when to leave and where to go and all those kind of basic XC skills, I recommend getting familiar flying to lions first. Get that down where it makes sense. And then when you have a good day where you're getting pretty high, like at least 9,000 feet, 10,000 or more would be better. Then it would be a good time to try flying to south. But for those of you that are ready, let's jump into it. So obviously, just like normal at Boulder, the key is finding whatever lift you can get above the ridge, and not leave any lift unless you have something better. And the goal is take your first climb as high as you can get, try to map out the air, figure out are there any inversion layers, things slowing you down. Today we're finding that, at least at this time, it's hard to get above about 8,500 feet. So once the climb's maxed out, first place to go is over to Mount Sanitas. Some people like to dive in here as soon as possible. I prefer to get kind of high at the hill because there's lots of other gliders to work with usually, and I'm a little more familiar with the places to find lift, and it's a little more convenient if I don't find lift. But Mount Sanitas tends to work either right along the summit ridge or sometimes out front. If you get really low, also this little hogsback can work. But ideally, you get high enough that you can find something without scratching. Don't land in this area. But you can land at North Boulder Park, which is this nice big green field here. It's totally fine. And if you do end up landing there, you can just walk out to Broadway and catch a bus back to the hill, so it's no big deal. The goal here is eventually we want to transition either onto Flagstaff or over to the Flatirons directly if possible. And it's nice if you can find climbs out front to the east, because then you can kind of start to try things out flying south, and if it's not working, you can run back to North Boulder Park. If you drift the climbs really far back to the west, unless you're super high, you're going to be pushing a headwind as you're crossing over, and you may have North Boulder Park out of range relatively quickly. So the more conservative route is to stay out front, find a good climb either over the smokestacks or over this neighborhood or even over Pearl Street, so that you always have North Boulder Park accessible, and then you can make a play towards running to Flagstaff, or if you're high enough, even going directly to the Flatirons. On this day, we were finding a lot of disorganized lift and really struggling to get much above 8,500 feet, which is not ideal. It's definitely better to be getting higher, but with our experience, it was within our skill set. So made a transition over to Flagstaff, arriving a little bit low, which is not ideal because when you're low in Flagstaff, you don't have any legal LZs on glide. I can't make it to North Boulder Park from this altitude, and Chautauqua, which is this big green area, is a no-no to land at. So I am committed to finding a climb, which often you can get at Flagstaff, but it can be uncomfortable to arrive low. So if you're not really familiar with scratching and staying alive and kind of tricky lift, I'd not recommend showing up as low as I am right now. But eventually you find the climb, and you want to get high enough to transition over to the first Flatiron. So this feature right here is the first Flatiron, and if you can arrive at it or a little bit below, you will almost certainly find a good climb, unless it's really shady or super crosswind or something, but it's a very reliable trigger. And then this area here is in-car, and it's okay to land there if you're on the south side or the east side of the road. And if you can make it to the first Flatiron, you basically have in-car on glide, especially if you have a tailwind. So you want to get relatively high. I recommend kind of a minimum of 8,000 feet, and like 8,500 is better, especially if you're on a lower performance glider. So be patient tanking up at Flagstaff before you dive in. And similar to the other transition is you want to be careful about not drifting too far back to the west. Otherwise, you'll be pushing a headwind and you may get low before you get around on the front side of the Flatirons. And then that inversion had been preventing us from getting super high. So there was lots of lift over the Flatirons like typical, but I just couldn't get high. So I'm just taking little bubbles and jumping on to the next one and working my way towards Bear Peak. And Bear Peak is just above me to the right, which tends to probably be the most consistent trigger on the entire Front Range. So usually you can get a good climb there before continuing on. This is El Dorado Canyon State Park, which you would not want to land in here for obvious reasons. It's also not allowed to land in here. So if you have to bomb out, landing somewhere along the highway would be your best bet. This whole area is Dowdy Draw, which is open space as well as this. So you kind of got to be near the road. And what we're going for is to get established on this terrain on the far side of El Dorado Canyon State Park. It looks a lot like the Flatirons, but it doesn't tend to work as well. So you want to avoid arriving super low here. It's better to hang out at Bear Peak and find a really good climb before making this jump over. But once you do make the jump over, I usually find something in the area of this Flatiron, and I try to take whatever I can get. Fortunately, I had two other gliders, Jared and Cedar, to work with, so we were able to just kind of hop from short thermal to short thermal, working our way towards Coal Creek Peak, which is also one of the better triggers on the Front Range. Sometimes the climb is over the summit, but a lot of the times it's actually out front, kind of over these plains area, not necessarily super far out. You want to be careful about going into the lee of Coal Creek Peak, but usually you'll find a good climb here, which is important because we have the next major logistical issue coming up, which is a huge series of do not land areas, which are marked by the northern boundary, which is Highway 72 that runs up Coal Creek Peak, and the eastern boundary, which is Highway 93 that runs north-south, and the southern boundary is 56th Avenue, which you can't really see from this angle, but it's way down here. So we have this giant area that's a do not land. You can land kind of in this neighborhood. They've been friendly to us so far, but generally you got to land on the north side of Highway 72 or right along it, or make it out to this intersection here. If you're pretty new and you don't have a lot of experience and you're not getting high or the lift's been difficult, you might consider turning back here and flying back to Boulder, or flying out east and flying the flats, making sure that you can land on the east side of Highway 93. There's a very hostile and aggressive landowner at the corner of this property that I'll highlight again in a moment. He is very aggressive and hostile to paragliders. He will call the police. He will maybe even try to detain you. So stay far, far, far away from this area. Don't land anywhere in here. But what we're going for is to get established on Ralston Buttes, which is this terrain here, which tends to work really well. You can also fly this backline terrain here, but you need to be careful about diving straight in there because this canyon tends to get a little more windy from a valley wind and Venturi effect. So if you try to cross too low and too deep, then you may bomb out in this area. So I like to try to get kind of high out front, and usually I'll fly the front terrain, but sometimes I'll fly the back. So the way that people tend to mess this up the most is this terrain is kind of low angle and it's not that high, and it doesn't work that well if you try to scratch it. So what people do is they scratch and scratch and scratch, and they get low and they kind of scratch down this downsloping terrain. Eventually they land out in here because it's very inviting, even though it's probably the worst place to land on the Front Range right now. So what you need to do is to always keep Highway 72 in mind as where you need to glide out to. So if you're getting low, you need to start working your way back out towards this highway to make sure that you're going to clear it. But as long as you're high enough, you can run along this terrain, and usually you'll find something good near the buttes, sometimes in this corner or directly above it. And it's not always there immediately, but a lot of times there's some workable lift. You want to get there, and then you want to tank up as high as you possibly can because we have one last important transition to make. So the end of the do not land area is this notch in the Hogsback where 56th Avenue is. Everything between me and there is a no land area. So this is the water treatment plant, which you can't land at. This is the mine, which you can't land at. And then this is the White Ranch open space. So we got to make it all the way out to this notch. And unless you have a really good glide or you're really high, you're probably going to have to pick up one more climb, which means you got to be really disciplined about taking whatever lift you can get, getting nice and high, and making sure that you clear this section. And then, so this notch is what I'm trying to get to. And at this point, my camera ran out of battery, and I had to plug it back into the external battery pack. So I just did one climb here. So I'm just directly above and a little bit past where we were just looking at. And our goal is to make it over to Lookout Mountain, which is over here. And now that we're past 56th Avenue, which is, I believe, this road here, all this stuff is fair game to land at except the highway department, which is a circular area. As long as you don't land here, you're okay. This field just on the north side of these houses is the horse pasture, which is a really popular landing area for lookout pilots. It's a much bigger, friendlier, less turbulent, fewer obstacles landing zone than the official landing area for lookout. So if you're kind of at your limit or the day is starting to die, you may consider landing here instead of continuing on. Otherwise, you can pick up a climb off of Mount Galbraith before making the transition over Clear Creek Canyon and getting established on the lookout. And obviously, going into Clear Creek Canyon would be a terrible place to land, so don't go back there unless you're high. And as you come up to Lookout, if you've never flown Lookout before, this little corner right here is the official landing zone. Don't land at any of these fields, which is a school of mines that we don't have permission to land at, so don't go there. The takeoff is right here for Lookout. And if you want to keep going, the soccer fields are way out here, and that's a popular mini XC for Lookout pilots. And it's a nicer place to land at than the main LZ, so all you really need to do is to get over to these antennas, pretty much get one more climb, and at that point you likely have the soccer fields on glide if you have a tailwind. If you want to keep going, this mine and this intersection over 285 often produces really well. And then as you keep going, you have two ways to kind of fly this line. You can either fly the back line, which works great, or you can fly the front line, which I'm doing today because I'm flying with two other people that are flying that, and the climbs just seem a little more organized out front. So that's why I'm taking the front line today. We are coming up on Red Rocks Park, which you can't land at, and that's all these cool-looking Flatiron formations over in here. So you can land along this road away from the park, or better is to land on the east side of these hogsbacks, just stay out of Bandimere Speedway. So really I would recommend don't land in here because the actual property boundaries are relatively complicated and it's kind of hard to figure out what's what unless you've spent a long time studying it. But it's really spectacular to fly over as long as you're high enough to clear this whole section. And at this point, the flying starts to not change a whole lot. You know, you have these small hogsbacks or the deeper line, which just runs north-south for a ways. Nothing really changes. And as you clear Red Rocks and Bandimere, the terrain and the landing zones start to open up a little more. So it gets a little easier to fly in terms of just not having all these areas you have to avoid. The trouble is this further south area tends to be kind of a crux. It doesn't work as well as the stuff we've just flown over often. So you can see how on each climb, we're not getting as high as we have been. We're having to take a lot of really broken, frustrating, slow climbs and being really patient, trying not to bomb out here. I'm currently with Cedar, and at the top of this climb, he decides to change strategy and go over to fly the deeper line. I decided to stick with what we've been doing because it's been working well enough, and I've been hoping that the day will just eventually turn on and get really good. Coming up is Chatfield Reservoir, which is a useful landmark because it tells you that you're starting to get close to some airspace out of DIA, which you can now start to see in the corner of the map over here. There's also Lockheed Martin, which is this facility over here in the corner, so don't land there. So if you need to land, these other fields on the east side of the Hogsbacks are the place to go. And then the next transition is Roxborough State Park, and you'll see that it looks like more of those little Flatirons, kind of like Red Rocks, and it's a whole do not land area, and it also tends to get windier and a little more stable in this area, a little cruxier. I made a strategic error at this point of not turning around like Jared did. I got a little greedy and was trying to extend my triangle, hoping to do a big one. And unfortunately, just the further south I went, the more stable it got, and I hit a bunch of sink. And that was basically the end of my day, and I had to go in next to this road and hitchhike out. So hopefully that helped you guys out, and you have a better idea of what to look for. And if you haven't seen my video going from Golden to Boulder the other way, you may find that helpful as well. You can find it on my channel.